Alright, folks. Just, this doesn't work, does it? Alright, guys, Time Stranger has been out for a while now, and I can't help but wonder what's next. Yes, I know there's DLC on the way, and they have their own quests, but I don't know how in-depth they're gonna be. I'm more concerned about what comes after the DLC, because I have no idea what it's gonna be. There are a few possible outcomes, one being that the game does so well that they add more DLC. I feel like this is something everyone wants, but also something that I never see actually happen, so I'm not going to hold my breath on that. Another potential is that it seems like the game is fired on all cylinders, but actually, when it comes down to it, it did not justify the money and time the company put into it, in their opinion. And this would mean that the next entry in the series will be scaled back, or take longer, or something like that, and let's just hope that's not the case. But I'm not going to be too optimistic or too pessimistic. I think it's going to be something in between, like we've seen before. And in that vein, I think it's a good bet that we're going to get a Hacker's Memory style sequel for Time Stranger. Something in the same engine, with many of the same assets, but greatly expanded. When you really think about it, a lot of the areas of this game are quite small, so we could easily go back to these biomes and just reuse a lot of the assets and say we're in a different area, not reuse like the same layouts, but give them different layouts and add some more things on it. They do that, put in some new story beats in these areas that are different from the main game, add maybe 100-ish new Digimon, recolors and babies probably included in that, new kinds of extra dungeons and maybe a replacement or update for the card game. But that's all easy to guess when you're assuming there's going to be a sequel. What leaves me kind of stumped is what the story's going to be. Time Stranger, and if you haven't beaten the game, I have no idea what you're doing in this video, but Time Stranger has an ending that is very similar to Cyber Sleuth. Game ends, timeline has changed, things are different, but also kind of the same. That makes it highly unlikely, in my opinion, that a sequel would actually take place after the ending, for the same reason that they chose not to do that for Hacker's Memory. And that's because if you're going to do that, you might as well just make a completely new story. Which might be what they do, but I really don't expect them to make another Olympus 12 game where they're featured and they're here and they have all their forms and stuff, but it's a different story and there's a different version of them. I suppose they could make a game about the Demon Lords using this engine and a lot of the assets, but that's not something I would assume based off what we know. I think the most likely scenario is that we get a game that takes place during the 8 years that we were missing. Now, the fact that it's been specifically 8 years probably isn't important. I think that's just the amount of years where they started and ended development. And, they wanted to show how Shinjuku's changed, which I didn't. I'm not Japanese, so I don't fucking know. The main reason that this time frame would be ideal is because this is a long section of time unaffected by time travel. Whatever would take place in the story could still be assumed to be true after Digimon has messed with the timeline during the second half of the game. And for this segment of time, I think there's only really two solid possibilities. The first, and in my opinion less likely option, is that it takes place in the human world. You would play as a human and deal with the Digimon having broken into our world and likely cross paths with Simmons and Asuna as your story is going on. Now, the obvious reason why I would doubt they would do this is because we would get way more focus on the human world, which is less interesting, and we know that nothing would really come of our actions by the time our main story characters would return from the time jump. Although it would be very interesting to see more development of the human characters, I don't think it's really worth making a whole game to focus on that, or even semi-focus on that. We could also travel to the digital world, because there is a digital gate, but what would we even be doing? The conflict is in the digital world, like, trouble on the home front. Considering we would be a lesser character who won't dramatically impact the fight against Chronomon, being involved with the human world conflict just seems like a dead end. And you'll probably die or become some comatose patient anyway by the end of the game to excuse you not being in Time Stranger. So it's not really ideal in my opinion. What I think is a much more interesting, likely and fitting option is tying the sequel to Lunamon and Coronamon. Before the 8-year time jump, we send them off to the cosmic area while they're still rookies, and after the 8 years, we find that not only have they evolved into megas, they can also fuse into Grace Novamon too, and even despite that, their relationship has broken down since then, because the implication is that you gotta be like buddy to fuse. So there was a point where they were megas, but their relationship was good enough that they could fuse together, and that is just the perfect opportunity for a whole new story. Following Lunamon and Coronamon and their relationship throughout some of those 8 years to eventually peak to their fusion would be a perfect climax for a story, and is already implied to be distant enough from where we meet them in Time Stranger for the events to not interfere with that game. In the context of Time Stranger, all these two are doing is training in the cosmic area. So this story could not have any ties to anything to do with Coronamon or anything like that. It could be much smaller scale and give a good opportunity to show the growth of the two of them. And it'll be featuring two Digimon that are pretty important to the Digimon story franchise. Now, there are a few issues with this idea. For example, won't the fact that we find them totally at odds with each other in Time Stranger completely undercut whatever growth they have in this assumed sequel game? Maybe a little bit, but it doesn't have to end with the two of them being like, oh boy, the two of us siblings will always trust each other forever and ever. Or if they do, you know, it can cut to Punkemon giggling or something, alluding to their fractured relationship in the main game. That would be kind of a cop-out because it wouldn't really explain the actual breaking down of the relationship part, but I mean, I think that would be... people would forgive that. It'd be considered good enough, in my opinion. I think the more pressing issue is who you will be playing as. Now, I do think it would be likely to be some self-insert type character who is mainly just standing around watching the drama unfold, much like Time Stranger and Cyber Sleuth, so that's fine. You don't technically have to play a human being. You could be playing as Minervamon, maybe with her own team, who is very likely to be showing up in this story. For Minervamon, you know, Minervamon is obviously going to show up in the story because she's the big sister. That is a bit of a challenge though, because in Time Stranger it's kind of implied she is surprised by how much they've progressed from whenever the last time she saw them. So that could cause some conflict or some plot holes, but you could just ignore that. Or maybe Minervamon is not in the ending and they're like, oh, I wish Minervamon could see us now, to kind of imply that. It would be good if you could just cut from that straight to Minervamon in the cell, but I think the implication is that Dianamon has confided her in things before she goes missing, which is after they become estranged, because she's confiding in Minervamon because Apollomon is someone she can't rely on anymore, so I don't know how to deal with that. The only thing I could really come up with is maybe all of their achievements in this game are down to Minervamon's leadership, or Minervamon is sharing her power with them to get them up. Maybe in Time Stranger they've now become what she saw of them then, without Minervamon having to share her power. That being said, you're most likely to be playing a human anyway. It's not like a human in the digital world would be unthinkable or anything, and I could speculate on what the storyline would be, but that would be like predicting Hacker's Memory storyline based off Cyber Sleuth, which is basically impossible. That's like 2 layers of guesswork. The human's personal story could be almost anything, though I think having 2 additional human characters who mirror Coronamon and Lunamon, and end up arguing like they do, and maybe even siding with their mirror Digimon during dramatic story beats, would be an interesting idea. And maybe whoever their Digimon are also fuse during the ending, or maybe it's implied that spiritually Lunamon and Coronamon are their Digimon, or something like that. And they should be siblings, of course. But this is just some idea I had. Honestly, I wouldn't be against them doing something completely unexpected, like using the Time Stranger assets to remake the DS games. A lot of the areas are very similar, and of course Alphamon and Coronamon were pretty significant in the first game, so I don't think that's completely out of the question. I do wonder if they would want to do that though. It might be easier for them to do that than for them to make a port or remaster of the DS games in a non-handheld type fashion, but I honestly have no idea when it comes to game development. And I don't know if this is obvious, but I really do like Lunamon and Coronamon, and I think they would work as main mascots for the story games, and I'd love to see them treated with the same reverence as Agumon and Gabumon. Maybe that's just my nostalgia talking, as I loved the DS games as a kid, especially using Lunamon in Dusk, but I personally don't want them relying on Omnimon and the Adventure Digimon as their main marketing tactics until the end of time. Have you guys seen what the DLC is going to be, by the way? Now, some of you might have noticed some problems with my ideas that I didn't notice, or have some better ones. Do comment and let me know. I know people in YouTube videos say that a lot and it's just to farm engagement, but I am genuinely interested because I feel like there's enough to speculate on this, but not enough to say anything for certain. Digimon as a franchise has also been gearing up for some time now, so maybe someone more market savvy would be able to guess what move Bandai would make at this point. Like, they're pushing Shambhala right now. Does that mean the next game is going to be Shambhala related, but there's some Shambhala in Beat Break, so, you know, stuff like that. Just everything all together. I feel like there's something you can figure out by looking at the whole picture. Maybe I would have leaned into Shambhala as a bigger possibility, but there's really not many of their Digimon in this game. I mean, they would add it, wouldn't they? Like, if they made a sequel Shambhala related, they would just add all the other Shambhala Digimon. But I don't know. I just wanted to talk about Lunamon and Coronamon, and I just feel like there's so much history implied by the short scenes that we get that I'm just actually so interested in these two in particular. Also kind of off topic, but I know she's too new, but they should add Medusamon and her line. I mean, it's literally Greek mythology, the game.